Well, we're continuing in our sermon series on the search for happiness today, and remember we're talking about this for a specific purpose. We were previously in our other sermon series that we did before this, we were talking about the covenant and how we get united to Christ in a covenant relationship. We get united to the Father through that covenant with Christ. And the problem that we have, that we experience, is that we find that people have covenants in other aspects of their lives, but most of the time, the problem that we run into is people have a hard time in our modern culture being happy in covenants. And it's the same in Christianity. I don't know about you guys, but when I was growing up, I saw a lot of pictures of Christians that were united to Christ, but some very unhappy, unpleasant people. And it's a tragedy when that happens. It's an absolute tragedy. And so we want to make sure that we understand not only that we're united to Christ, but we understand that how joy and happiness should be a mark of that union with Him. So Job chapter 39, verse 19, we're kind of picking a strange passage because it doesn't have any characters that you're familiar with, and it doesn't say a lot about what you might be expecting. Job chapter 39, verse 19, it's a passage about a horse. And we'll understand, hopefully, what this has to do with the pursuit of happiness and being in a covenant. Job chapter 39, verse 19, it says, "Do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like the locust? His majestic snorting is terrifying. He paws in the valley and exults in his strength. He goes out to meet the weapons. He laughs at fear and is not dismayed. He does not turn back from the sword. Upon him rattle the quiver, the flashing spear, and the javelin. With fierceness and rage he swallows the ground. He cannot stand still at the sound of the trumpet. When the trumpet sounds, he says, 'Aha!' He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of the captains and the shouting." Now, here's the thing that we need to understand as we look at this passage is it's not any Bible characters you're familiar with. Jesus isn't in it. It's kind of a strange passage, but the reason that we're choosing it is because today we're talking about a really indispensable quality for being happy in a covenant, and that is meekness. Now, why are we talking about this horse in relationship to meekness? Because that's actually the definition of meekness. Meekness is not being weak or unpowerful, and you've probably heard that a million times if you've been in church, but the definition of meekness was used of a well-trained war horse. And that's the picture that we have here given in Job, is a well-trained war horse. This well-trained war horse is happy to go into battle. He exults in his strength. He laughs at fears, not dismayed. He has fierceness to him. He says, "Aha," when the trumpet sounds. So here's the thing. A regular horse runs away from all of this stuff, right? A regular horses aren't dumb. They're just not. They're smart animals. How many of you guys have been out to the river and seen the wild horses out there? They're pretty cool. The thing is that wild horses aren't dumb. If you come up to a wild horse, what does it do? It generally splits, right? It goes away from you. Let alone if you're making the sounds and din of battle. If you have all kinds of activity going on and noise, it's going to run right away. Here's the thing. How many of you ever tried to ride a horse that wasn't too keen on people? Anybody ever try to do that? It can be a fairly unpleasant and short-lived experience. It can be very sharp and short because that horse, he doesn't want anything to do with you. Now, here's the thing. If you train a horse, you can actually train him to do what this passage is talking about. You can train a horse to not only take a rider, but to go fiercely into battle instead of running terrified away from it. You can train a horse to actually enjoy his strength in the midst of all the chaos and din of battle. But what it requires of the horse is that the horse has to be submitted. He has to have this strength, and it has to be submitted and under the control of the rider. And what's interesting is the horse then comes to trust the rider, that the rider is going to steer him to where the horse is going to be not killed by all of this. That as the horse has gone into and out of battle, He understands his strength because his strength is then applied to that battle. And then he comes to, metaphorically, rejoice in his strength. His strength is actually exposed. It's actually made fruitful. It's actually developed and seen in all of its glory in the midst of that battle that normally he would have never experienced because he would have run away. But because his strength is under control, he gets to experience all that. That's what it actually means to be meek. It doesn't mean being weak. It means having your strength under control, having your strength disciplined, having your strength fettered, if you will. Having it blocked in, having it directed. You see, the important thing for us to understand is that the reason that a lot of people are not happy in any kind of covenant is because they lack the meekness to take advantage of the covenant, to understand the glory. And their own glory and their own strength is never revealed because they don't have the meekness to let the covenant do that for them. So we're going to ask ourselves a few questions today, 3 to be precise. We're going to ask ourselves, why is meekness a requirement for life? Number 2, we're going to ask ourselves, what are the benefits of meekness? And number 3, we're going to ask, how is meekness related to joy or happiness? How is it that we need meekness to be happy? In our search for happiness, how is meekness going to help us? Because most of the time, people would say it won't help us. In fact, as we investigate our first question, why is meekness a requirement for life? We'll see that meekness is not just something that is a good idea. It's actually a necessity. Covenants are things that create boundaries and restraints. They create fetters. They box you in. Covenants do that. So the thing is, if you have a covenant, you become an American, you're now an American citizen, that kind of boxes you in, right? There's laws and rules and things that you now become yours. There's a people that you now have to own, right? Because a covenant means you're one of us. Yippee, right? You're one of us. That's what a covenant does. You can have a covenant with a company. You know, the thing is, when you get hired from a company, you represent them, they represent you. You have to follow their rules and their guidelines, and you have to come in when they say you do. It creates boundaries for you. When you get married, that's a covenant. It creates those things. You say, I'm going to give up everybody else, and I'm going to be married to you. Now, the problem is that Our culture has a terrible time being happy in covenants because these restrictions, these boundaries, these restraints, they cause us nothing but alarm in our society. Our society sees boundaries and limitations as an absolute, unmitigated evil. And what our society sees as good is being able to do whatever you want, to be whatever you want, to define yourself however you want to define yourself, and to define your own reality, and to demand that reality then reciprocate and be what you want it to be. There's no need in our culture for compromise. There's the understanding and idea that you can have it all, and if you can't have it all, somebody has robbed you of having it all. That's the way that our culture proceeds now. You are alone. Define yourself in any way that you want to, and there is no restriction, physical or otherwise. Remember, I was telling you guys a few months ago, it's the other day, right? Time to me, if it's not today, it's the other day. So the other day, I was telling you guys about those people who identified themselves, one as a yellow scaly lizard, and the other one identified as a building. And there was actually a company had to have a meeting because the people in the company had to be taught how to treat these people who identified themselves as a building and a scaly reptile type dragon. Because obviously you don't know, right? You don't know. I've never worked with a dragon, so I don't know how to deal with them. So the people had to come in and teach everybody in the office how to deal with them. That's where our culture is. And in fact, our culture is about the destruction of every category that exists. Any category that you think of, our culture is in the process of trying to destroy that category. Any kind of boundary, our culture is about destroying it. There should be no borders. Nobody's religious values should really be fetters in any way. There's no meaning in the term man or woman. There's no content there. I was reading an article the other day. The flag is offensive because it's not inclusive enough, because it's not a flag for everybody, so we should get rid of it. And our culture is eroding. I was listening to a film critic talk about how films now need to be made for the world. And so he was talking about how the problem is that in order to be made from the world, they can't be made for a specific culture anymore. You see, what happens is movies now cost so much to make that the American box office isn't enough to pay for them. So they have to appeal to as many markets as possible. And it was talking about the plight of a lot of directors now who they have such a laundry list of things they can't do or can't say, or values that they can't promote, or boxes that have to be checked in order to make it palatable to the entire world, that when we experience them as being bland. It's kind of like this, if you've ever had a family reunion or a get-together and you say, well, I'm going to cook. Is there anything, you make the mistake of sending out a text or a email to everybody. Is there anything that anybody can't eat, right? And by the time you get the list of things that everybody can't eat, you realize you can't make anything. Well, that's the way that it's become. The interesting thing is all this adds up to something that I will call slouching toward non-existence. We are currently slouching toward non-existence. And there's a very interesting and important reason why that's true. Because for anything to be, you have to define both what it is and what it isn't. It's important to grasp this idea. In order for anything to be, in order for anything to exist, you have to define what it is and what it isn't. There has to be a boundary line. Otherwise, that thing doesn't exist anymore. For instance, if you don't have any boundary lines, what you have is an undifferentiated mass. Let's say that we have a building here, and we do, okay? So our building is made up of a lot of differentiated things. We have seats, we have flooring, we have walls, we have ceilings, we have lights, we have people. We have all these things in this building. Imagine that a tornado so powerful came through that it removed any distinction. There's now no distinction in this room of anything. Somebody could walk in forensically and they can't tell the difference between anything in this room. That's what happens if you don't have any boundaries, right? And the problem is once you lose boundaries, you lose identity. Identity is created not by just what something is, but by what something isn't. There has to be a boundary line when you say this is what we are and this is what we're not. It's interesting that in some cultures, in some religions, the idea of heaven is not heaven, it's nirvana. And we should understand that nirvana is not heaven, because nirvana is the final destructions of all distinctions, even the distinction between you and everything else. It's a nothingness. That is not the way the Bible describes heaven. That is not heaven at all. You see, the thing that we have to understand is that as you break down boundaries and distinctions, you're actually losing yourself. You're actually losing yourself. You're losing your identity. And if you were to, in your mind and in your life, break down every distinction and every boundary that you have, you would not find your life getting fuller and richer. What you would find is something that's psychologically very close to hell, because you would start losing your sense of yourself. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 24, Jesus says, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who has built his house on the rock." He's saying, look, if you take these words that I'm teaching you and you apply them to your life, you're like a wise man who's built his house upon a rock. You're actually creating a life for yourself that has solidity, that has a foundation, that will stand up to difficulties and hardships. Because here's the thing, is that life is full of suffering. And you need to understand that suffering is either redeemed or it's not. There's a lot of times when you experience suffering in your life, you think, I wish somebody would just get rid of the suffering. But in reality, you don't really want that, do you? Have you ever lost somebody that was close to you? And that pain was really difficult. Maybe it was a breakup or maybe they passed away. Whatever the situation, you lost somebody close to you and the hurt was just overwhelming. And you want relief from it, but you realize that if that hurt can just be taken away from you, that's not really what you want, because then you wouldn't have anything left of the person at all. It'd be like they didn't ever exist. And so you hurt and you don't know what you want, but really, in reality, what you want is you want that hurt redeemed. You want to say there's something that's so good and so worthwhile that this hurt can be redeemed by that. There's something so good that this hurt becomes, it's like when you're working out, right? And when you work out and you're sore, like you can be too sore. I heard about people who did CrossFit after taking off for a while and end up in the hospital and like their limbs are all gigantic. Have you seen that? And sometimes they have to be amputated. You don't want, I'm not talking about that kind of soreness. I'm not talking about that kind of soreness. But when you work out and you're sore, and it kind of feels good. Why does it kind of feel good? Because in your mind you're like, I'm stronger. And this is connected to that. And so rather than being annoyed by this soreness, I actually like it. Now, I'm not saying you're going to like all the suffering in your life, but I'm saying there's a hint there of this reality that when you're in pain, the thing you often want is not necessarily for the pain to be gone. What you want is there to be something that's so good that it redeems the suffering that you're going through. That this is creating for me something so good that in the end, it'll all have been worth it. Well, in order for that to happen, you have to have a differentiation. Some things have to be that good. And if you have Jesus' words, what you find is what Jesus defines is he defines differentiation. He defines things. He makes categories and he lays out what's truly good and what's worthwhile, and it becomes something that's so good that it's worth the suffering you go through in your life, and so it becomes that solid rock that you can build your life on through all of the storms that happen. Remember when Jesus was creating the world, he said he separates the light from the darkness. He separates the waters above from the waters below. He separates the oceans and the dry land. He separates man and woman. He separates things and gives them identities, and then he brings them into relationship with one another. That separation is so vital. It's so crucial. I was reading about the Millennium Tower in San Francisco. Have you guys heard of this place? They built this high-rise in San Francisco, and they sold off the apartments and condos in it. And some of the condos were going for anywhere from $2 million to like $4, $5, $6 million. I think the most expensive one was $10 million. And so these people bought this condo, and then what they found was that in a few years, the building had sunk by 16 inches. It's not small, right? And now the tower's leaning. And so they did this big investigation, and what they found was at the very beginning before the construction process ever started, that the construction company knew that the way that they were building the tower wasn't adequate. See, it's close to the ocean, and the problem is that it's built on sand, and they drove down some piers, some pilings into the sand to give it stability, but the building is so big and so tall and so heavy that people were like, hey, that's not going to work. You got to go down to the bedrock. But that was super expensive, and so they decided not to do it. Even now, Jesus' parables are lived out in reality. And so now what they have to do is they have to go back and they have to drive down all the way into the bedrock, and it's going to cost massive amounts of money. So the building company is paying for some of it, the people who live in the building are paying for some of it, and apparently the taxpayers of San Francisco are paying like $30 million. Because if the building falls over, it's going to wipe out other buildings. Jesus is saying, look, things that are undifferentiated, they're not something solid to build your life on. So the second thing, this is why meekness is a requirement for life, is that you have to actually differentiate yourself and other things in order to actually live, in order to have an identity. The second thing that we need to understand is, what are the benefits of meekness? So I've now have a life, but then so what? What does it do for me now? Well, meekness means being under the control, being reined in, being led by something else, and not resisting that, but cooperating with that. And so you find an identity when you do that, but then there are other benefits. Now, here's the thing. You can say to yourself, okay, well, I need some differentiation in order to live, but then I don't know what to use, because lots of things can do that, right? There's lots of religious systems, lots of philosophies, there's lots of things that can help me differentiate myself from the rest of the world, to tell me who I am and what I am so that I can live. So how do I know which to choose? Maybe I can just choose my own. Why don't I just define myself? I'll realize that I need some definition and some boundaries, but I'll just do it myself. The question is, are you wise enough to define yourself fruitfully? Do you have the wisdom that it takes in order to do this for yourself? I was listening to a psychologist talk about changing complex systems. Let's say you have a really, really complex system. What are the odds that you can go in and make a change to that complex system and have it be beneficial? Take like a 747. Let's say they tell you, you're at the gate of the airport, and they tell you, look, your flight has been delayed. There's a problem with the plane. And the mechanics have just walked off the job. They just left. They quit. And so the person at the gate comes with the toolbox and says, all the passengers got together and we elected you to fix the problem. And they just hand you the toolbox. You need to make a change to the plane that will be beneficial. What are the odds of that happening? What are the odds of you taking a complex system like a 747 and making some kind of change that will be beneficial? Other than maybe removing yourself from the flight. It's pretty small, right? It's very small. Imagine that the other thing they said is, we're going to spin the wheel, and we're going to, whatever the wheel says, that's the change we're going to make. Well, that's obviously, don't fly with that scenario, right? Get off, go away. You take a cab all the way to your destination, whatever you have to do. Well, here's the thing. In order to change complex system, you have to have a knowledge of the complexity of the system. You have to be very, very wise. And there's almost no chance that this is going to be beneficial if it's random. In fact, even when you know the systems, it's very likely that you're not going to make a change that's beneficial. I was reading about another building. I don't know why buildings have been coming up so much recently, but Citicorp in New York City. Have you guys heard the story about Citicorp in New York City? So they bought this property to put a high-rise in, but there was a church there, and the church still wanted to meet there. And so Citicorp said, fine, we'll let you meet here. And what they did was they changed the design of the building so that rather than being anchored on the four corners, they would actually anchor it in the middle of the sides of the building. And so the building's kind of a little bit up on stilts so that underneath it can sit a church and people can worship in it. And so they had one of the best, most renowned engineers working on the building, and they built the building and everything seemed fine. He figured out a system that was pretty simple and elegant to make this work. It looks bizarre, and you look at it and you say, that seems a little iffy, right? But an engineer did this, and so it must be fine. Well, here's the thing that's interesting. An undergraduate was actually studying that building for an assignment, and she came up with a problem. You see, buildings have to be made for wind load, and there was a problem that she couldn't figure out, that this building didn't have any wind load kind of compensation for it. And the reason for it was because the engineer had realized that the compression, the weight of the building was so massive that they didn't really need to worry about wind load. But then she actually brought up a point. She said, yeah, I came up with those calculations too, but then I thought about what happens if the wind comes on one of the corners. So it's actually blowing on two sides of the building at once. What then? Because according to my calculations, this building will fall down if a 70-mile-an-hour wind hits it on both sides at the same time. And he's like, oops. Turns out she was right. One of the biggest buildings in New York City, if it had been hit by the right wind, could have fallen over. And they calculated that if it had fallen over in the wrong direction, that it could have killed as many as 200,000 people. So you know what they did? They secretly fixed it. They brought in welders from up to 100 miles away to get enough of them. And every night when the building was empty, they went in secretly and fixed the building and didn't tell anybody until it was fixed. Now, this guy that designed it was one of the preeminent engineers in the world, and he made a very simple mistake. What do you think the odds are that you can take a system as complex as life, and you can put all the boundaries in your life exactly where they need to go? You can make all the right differentiations, and you can come out with something that's going to be a blessing. What are the odds of that? The reality is you are not predisposed to wisdom or goodness. You're not. You're not predisposed to those things. You know, we talked about in Romania how they had all those orphans. There's so many of them that most of them were only fed and clothed, but there was no love shown to them. They weren't taught anything. And how they grew up not knowing how to speak. They didn't grow up knowing how to speak or how to take care of themselves or how to think. They didn't know how to do any of those things that we take for granted. You see, the thing is, ingrained in you is not the proper distinctions that you need to actually make a good life. Everything, this is so important for us to understand, every blessing that you have in your life is because somebody put a boundary on you. In love, somebody put a boundary on you. They said, this is how you're going to form words. This is how you're going to say things. This is how you're going to take care of yourself. This is how you're going to feed yourself. This is what it means to live in a society. This is what it means. And at every turn in love, somebody actually put boundaries on you. And you were meek enough to accept those. They didn't come from within you. You didn't come up with those on your own. You didn't come out of the womb knowing that stuff. Everything you are is the result of the limitations being imposed on you out of love. In Psalm 119, there's this great passage in verse 112 and 113. It says, I incline my heart to perform your statutes forever to the end. I hate the double-minded, but I love your law. This is David saying, this is why I love God. I love God because He puts on me the boundaries and the limitations that actually create for me a good identity and a good life. It's so interesting that in the ancient world, the judgment of God was seen as a glorious thing. And in the modern world, it's seen as this terrible thing. Because the judgment of God in the Old Testament mind was Him telling mankind the distinctions between what is good and what is bad, what you are and what you're not, how you should live and how you shouldn't live. And the end result of those judgments, God making those distinctions and telling mankind what is ultimately glorious, was that we got to participate in that glory. Finally, we need to see how is meekness related to joy. So we know that we need meekness. It's a requirement for life because you have to define yourself. And in order to do that, you have to say what you are and what you're not, what you're for and what you're against. We've seen that there's great benefits of meekness. That is that you can have a glorious and good life because the impositions and the limitations that are put on you. But finally, how is meekness related to joy? So one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is this issue of self-pity and grumbling and how it becomes a habit of our hearts. I don't know if you guys have known this or seen this in yourself, or maybe you know somebody who does this. You know me, so there you go. But grumbling can become a habit of your heart. How many of you guys have gone outside in the morning the last, week or so, and thought, oh my goodness, what has happened to this world? I mean, you go outside and it feels like you're just melting. You know what I'm talking about? It's not just the heat, but the humidity on top of it. It's just oppressive and it's overwhelming. And you're like, no, I hate this, right? And then you get into your car and then it's just amplified. And you think, oh, this is it's terrible. And then you have to stop at a light, and then and this goes on and throughout your day. And you can find yourself all the time being like, oh, this is so terrible. And most of them are the limitations that are placed on our life. And this becomes kind of a habit of our heart. And so even sometimes when reasonable things happen to us or reasonable impositions get placed on us, we start to just have this habit of our heart, that we grumble and we feel sorry for our situation. You know what I've come to realize is only the truly meek and humble person can experience true joy. Because there's so many boundaries in our lives that if we start having a habit of life where we grumble at those boundaries, you will find that everywhere you look, there's a boundary. Everywhere you look, there's a reason to grumble, if that's what your heart starts to trend toward. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 12 through 15, there's a great passage having to do with King David. It says, "And it was told King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God." So remember what happened was David was going to bring the ark up to Jerusalem, but then it was put on a cart, and the cart slipped, and the guy put his hand out, and he died. You remember that whole thing happened. And so David was like, oh, I was trying to do something good, and it was something terrible. And, he's mad. He's mad about the fact that there's these boundaries and limitations that God has put, and they've come back to bite David, and he got upset about it. And then what happened was it stopped on its path to Jerusalem, and it just kind of got shuttled off to this guy's house. And this guy's had it at his house. And this guy was like looking at what happened, and he said, well, I'm not going to touch it, right? I learned from watching that guy touch it. I'm not going to touch it. And so what happened is that he treated it with the respect that God wanted. And so it says, told it to the king, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So he respected the boundaries that God put on him, and because of that, everything about him and his household was prospering. It says, so David went and brought up the ark from God to the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. David sees the boundaries and what happens when you live according to those, when you let those things be like a bridle to you, a bit in your mouth, you let what the word of God and the respect that God demands of himself and his word, when you let that control your life, then what you see is that there's great blessing. And so David saw that, and with rejoicing he has the ark brought up to Jerusalem. And it says in verse 13, and when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. And David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. Here's the interesting thing. David is a warrior. And he's letting the word of God put boundaries in his life. And he's here dancing before the Lord, dancing in joy. I read that passage, and then I read what's in Job 39 about about the horse and how it goes into battle with exultation. And I see a parallel there. David is like that horse. He's the man whose life has been put in boundaries by God. And because he sees those boundaries as good things, because he is a meek person, he has the humility to see that these boundaries are necessary and good, he can rejoice in his life before God. He's the kind of guy who can be in a covenant and rejoice. This word of life that comes from God is a word that's full of boundaries and limitations, and that's the word of life. Have you come to understand that God called you into existence by separating you from everything else? That's how God calls you into existence. He separates you from everything else that's been created. There are boundaries and limitations, and that's how you got to be here. Do you understand that God redeemed you by separating you from the sin that was your death on the cross? And you also understand that God brings you into paradise by separating the sheep and the goats in the final judgment? At every turn, it's the separation, it's the boundaries, it's the differentiation that God has for us that brings life and joy and fruitfulness and blessing and glory. At every turn, it's God saying, stay away from those things that are the antithesis of everything that you want, of everything that is good, of everything that's a blessing. And you can either look at those boundaries and say, oh, this is terrible, and you can be miserable under the yoke of God, or you can say, this is joy and life and goodness, and praise God from keeping me from everything that is the antithesis of what is good in my life. And you can live in joy, or you can live in misery, and the choice is yours. But meekness is indispensable for joy. In light of that, how do you respond? You know, the interesting thing is we've had for a long time at our church, we've had a mission statement. It says that we exist to glorify God by being the presence of Christ in the world. And you know that glorify can be also said, we can use some synonyms there. We can say worship. We exist to worship God. We exist to celebrate God. We exist to take joy in God by being the presence of Christ in the world. And we break this down into three parts. We believe what? We believe that He is worthy of our joy and celebration. We believe that God, in all the things that He puts on us, the bridle, the bit that He puts in our mouth, we believe that He is worthy of our joy and celebration. We belong to the community of celebration and praise, and we become, what do we become? We become worshipers, peoples whose lives are marked by joy in Him. That's what we are, and that's who we are, and that's what we are becoming. And meekness is indispensable to that. Well, how do we apply what we've learned? First, obey God joyfully. I mean, there's so many things to think about in your life. Where are the areas in your life that you're obeying God, but maybe not doing it joyfully? Are there areas in your life where you're grudgingly obeying God? Man, that needs attention. There's a mismatch there. You're not understanding God's love for you and His reasons for calling you to obedience if you're obeying Him but aren't joyful about it. Next, pay attention to your attitude. When these limitations and boundaries come up, it's not just enough to say, I'm not going to grumble, but do you rejoice in Him? Do you rejoice in who He is? Do you take joy and say, man, God is good to me. He has put the boundary lines for me in pleasant places. I pray that as a congregation, we would have the meekness to celebrate God.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page, where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out our past lessons and videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.